television gravitates to flames and cars being tipped over and shots being fired and so on. And so almost predictably, a movement is going to get more media attention if there is an element of that kind of unrest, for better or worse. So I think there's a media component to that. I think it also jars the public out of complacency. And I think King understood that. King used to talk about you need to create a crisis to begin a dialogue. And he wasn't necessarily talking about a violent crisis, but he understood that people had to be shaken out of their complacency. And I think you've got a combination of it. If people had been going to work, 40-hour, 60-hour work weeks, George Floyd comes on TV. Okay, that's tonight's news. Got to go pack the kids' lunch for school tomorrow. It might not have sunk in to the average American psyche as fully as it did because they have more time right now to pay attention. And I do think the flames also get their attention. But it seems to me that some of the looting and so on are hitting higher end targets. They're going down Melrose Avenue. They're hitting some of the wealthier areas of the east side of Manhattan and so on. I don't think that's accidental. I feel that another thing that's different this time is it's not just occurring in the ghetto. It is occurring all across town, including in front of the White House, and so on. And I think the message of the violence that has occurred is different, but I do think it propels coverage. It gets people's attention. And, in the end, is it more counterproductive than productive? That's a matter of long debate. But it does seem to be a piece of important movements, both in the 60s and now.
In all of my study of American political history, and particularly in the revolutionary period, right? I never saw a really large exploration of the role of violence and property destruction vis-a-vis the Boston Tea Party. I was never exposed to a conversation or a lecture or a chapter in a book that expressed concern over the destruction of property during the Boston Tea Party, right? And I saw an article a little while ago said if adjusted for inflation, those rabble-rousers destroyed in today's dollars, it would be $1.7 million worth of property. And maybe, and again, I'm a historian, so I'm thinking about books that have been written about the revolutionary period. All right, I've got a couple of them right over here. I could pull them out, and I'm pretty sure I will not find a paragraph expressing concern about the destruction of property. And I think about that a lot because I think about the ways in which violence has been very explicitly applied to advance political agendas all throughout American history. One of the questions I think is why is that violence being applied in that particular moment? Right? I go back to King, I go back to other folks who say, if you consistently and persistently and systematically disregard the most marginalized people in your society, this is one of the places where you can potentially wind up. This should not be a surprise. We're here because of, right? And we see the violence erupting because of consistent and persistent inability and unwillingness to heed the voices and to address the concerns that have been articulated to elected officials, to civic leaders, and to anybody else who will listen. We've refused to hear those concerns with regard to police violence, with regard to economic inequality, right? As Mark so very eloquently laid out, right? We've seen titanic levels of economic inequality growing and building in American society since the 1970s. And I would add to that, right, that basically, as we all know, right, when white America has a cold, Black America has pneumonia, right? So the realities of economic inequality are amplified for communities of color. And so when we think about violence in this moment, my challenge to people is to think about the ways that violence has been deployed in not only moments that look like this, but also other moments across time. So then we can have a better and clearer view of the ways in which violence may or may not be productive. Is it disturbing to see the target on fire? Sure. Yes, it is. But there's a lot of disturbing things that got us to this point. I think it's also really important to know that throughout the civil rights period, we saw this playing out repeatedly. We saw it playing out here in Memphis, that the agent provocateurs, right, the people here in Memphis, right, you know, when protests broke out, when King was in Memphis in March of 1968, it's been well documented now that the people who were fomenting that violence were agents of the federal government, right? They were FBI agents who were here to foment unrest so that they could essentially arrest more people, right? So that's the other thing that's also very much in play here. We're getting an increasing amount of evidence that there are people in these crowds who were there with the express purpose of provoking the cops, with the express purpose of destroying property, with the aim and goal of inflaming the situation. So that is also going on here as well. And I think it's really important for us to acknowledge that fact.